September 13th, 1991. Burbank, California. 37-year-old Tom Roche makes plans to meet his spouse, Barbara Rondeau, for lunch, but never shows up. And when Barbara returns home, she discovers that Tom is missing. 6 days later, Barbara receives an envelope containing some of Tom's personal items, along with an anonymous confession letter to his murder. While there is some speculation that Tom staged his own disappearance, his skeletal remains are eventually discovered in a remote area 500 miles away. Tom's cause of death is determined to be a gunshot wound, but the circumstances of how he wound up dead, as well as the identity of the letter writer, remain unknown. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and we've got a pretty mysterious cold case to cover today. The unexplained 1991 death of Tom Roche. This story was featured on an episode of Unsolved Mysteries, and I consider it to be one of the more underrated segments featured on the show. It doesn't get as much discussion as some of their other unsolved cases, but I think it's a real puzzler. Tom Roche was a motorcycle enthusiast who seemed to have an ideal life, as he was living with his girlfriend of 16 years and was days away from starting a new job he seemed really excited about before he inexplicably went missing. Even though Tom's spouse soon received an anonymous letter from someone confessing to his murder, there was some speculation that this may have been a hoax, as one witness claimed to have seen Tom alive the day after he disappeared. While Tom's skeletal remains were discovered hundreds of miles away, and the circumstances of his death do suggest foul play, all the pieces of the puzzle in this story just do not completely fit together, and after 2 decades, the investigation has never turned up any solid suspects who would have had a motive to murder Tom. So we're going to explore all the different potential scenarios on today's episode and try and figure out what happened to him. However, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music, and Spotify. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, which may include stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content. So with all that out of the way, let us now delve into the mysterious death of Tom Roche. Our story begins in Burbank, California in 1991. Our central figure is 37-year-old Tom Roche, who lives with his 32-year-old spouse, Barbara Rondeau. Tom was originally born in Boston and grew up in Rhode Island, which is where he met Barbara. They had been a couple for 15 years and lived together for 8 of them, and they both decided to make the move from Rhode Island to California in 1988. Tom and Barbara share a mutual passion for motorcycles and love riding on Tom's Harley-Davidson together, and they both belong to a motorcycle club which often goes on weekend trips around California. With his long hair, bushy beard, and multiple tattoos, the 6'2", 210-pound Tom fits the stereotypical appearance of a biker, but while he's known for being a free-spirited individual, both he and Barbara hold down regular jobs and are very well liked among their social circle. Tom is a machinist whose trade was metal plating, and he was working as a supervisor in a machine shop before he caught the attention of a company which plated airplane parts, who offered Tom a management position with a higher salary. Tom accepted the job, and his scheduled start date is Monday, September the 16th, 1991. On Friday, September the 13th, Tom dropped Barbara off at the blueprint company where she worked. The couple made plans to have lunch together, and Tom said he was planning to spend the morning installing a new battery on his motorcycle before he returned to pick up Barbara at noon. However, Tom failed to show up for their lunch date, and he did not even phone Barbara to let her know, which was very uncharacteristic of him. When she did not hear from Tom for the rest of the afternoon, Barbara became very concerned, and when she returned home to their apartment at 5:30 p.m., she was surprised to discover that the front door was unlocked, and when Barbara went inside, she could find no sign of Tom. Strangely, the newspaper by the front door was unopened, even though Tom usually read the sports page every morning. The battery Tom had been planning to install on his motorcycle was also still resting on the counter. Whenever Tom was at home, he had a habit of turning off the answering machine and would only turn it back on whenever he left. But even though Tom was not there, the machine was still off. After Barbara spent a sleepless night waiting for Tom, he still did not return by morning, so she decided to contact the police and report him missing. Investigators discovered that after dropping Barbara off at work, Tom went to his bank to make 2 deposits at 8:20 a.m. Since he did not withdraw any money, this seemed to indicate that Tom had no plans to go anywhere that day. One of Tom's neighbors at his apartment complex would also tell police that she saw Tom that morning with an unidentified white male at approximately 9:30 a.m. The two men were talking while standing next to a brown pickup truck before Tom proceeded to look into the truck's bed. According to the witness, they were not arguing, and there was nothing to indicate that something might be wrong. This would turn out to be the last confirmed sighting of Tom, but Barbara had no idea who this other man could have been. She started posting up missing persons flyers for Tom all throughout the area, and police were hopeful that he would turn up within a few days. Well, the case took a disturbing turn on September 19th, when Barbara received an envelope in her mailbox which was addressed to the family of Tom Roche. When she opened it, she found some of Tom's personal belongings inside, including his driver's license, credit card, and one of his earrings. But most distressingly, these items were wrapped in an anonymous 2-page typewritten letter which contained a confession to Tom's murder. Now, the excerpt I'm about to read here is the first part of the letter, which was displayed on screen during the Unsolved Mystery segment. It read, quote, "I am suffering a great deal of guilt right now about what I have done, and I feel it is necessary to write about it for my sake. You don't know me, and hopefully you never will, but I am the one who killed Tom Roche. I cannot and will not go to jail. I can never handle it. I almost lost my mind. Never again. I loved being in Vietnam. In fact, those were the happiest days of my life. I felt such a rush whenever I had a confirmed kill that it was hard to switch it off when I came back to the States. For 18 long years I have held this in check, despite the nightmares and fantasies about killing. This Jeffrey Dahmer thing really got to me, and I wondered if I could still do it. I figured LA would be the best place for what I had in mind. I did not just want a random thing, because you can get caught that way, so I set up a plan. I met Tom in a strip joint in the valley and got to talking. He fell for it, and we arranged to meet on Friday the 13th. I killed him shortly after I got there. I must assure you that it was neat and quick. He did not suffer at all." Now, it's here where the letter cuts off, and I know that certain sections have been withheld from the public by law enforcement. But I do know that the writer also claimed that Tom's body had been dumped in some mountains in the Los Angeles area, and that Tom's personal belongings were included with the letter in order to prove that the whole thing wasn't just some sick joke. The letter concluded with, quote, "I'm very sorry for what I have done. I know that in time, the guilt will leave me, so will your pain." The envelope did not have a return address, and investigators have not disclosed the postmark from the city it was mailed from, and no fingerprints could be found on the envelope or the letter. Anyway, this created a genuine fear that Tom had been abducted and murdered by an unknown perpetrator, but Barbara cannot think of anyone who might have had a motive to harm him. In spite of his free-spirited nature, Tom had no criminal record or history of drug usage, and didn't have any known enemies. The detail about Tom having originally met his killer at a strip joint did ring true, since Tom did like to hang around in topless bars from time to time. However, there would soon be an additional complication which caused his letter to be interpreted in a different way. Andy Marsala, the owner of a motorcycle parts shop in the nearby city of Glendale, came forward with an unusual eyewitness sighting of Tom. Marsala knew Tom personally and claimed that he had seen him in his shop on Saturday, September the 14th, the day after Tom originally went missing. Tom was a regular customer there, and Marsala thought he was acting strangely. Even though Tom usually chatted and joked around with Marsala whenever he frequented the shop, Tom did not even acknowledge him this time around. Marsala said he went into the back to grab some parts for another customer, but when he returned, Tom was gone. This sighting created speculation that perhaps Tom had disappeared voluntarily and typed up a false confession letter to send to Barbara alongside some of his personal items in order to make her believe that he had been murdered. Of course, Barbara never believed this theory for a second, especially since Tom was about to start a new job he was very excited about. She maintained that if Tom wanted to end their relationship, he would have done so to her face, and she really did not think he would have left his beloved Harley-Davidson behind. And if Tom took off on his own, he did not touch any of the money in his bank account and broke off all contact with his brother and 5 sisters. Investigators ultimately leaned towards the possibility that Andy Marsala simply got his dates mixed up and that he had actually seen Tom in his shop on another date prior to September the 14th. The next big development occurred on January the 11th, 1992, when some weathered bone fragments were discovered in a wooded area beneath a remote hillside in the Sacramento Valley, located in Placer County, nearly 500 miles north of Burbank. A number of personal items were also found near the remains, including a duffel bag, flashlight, hunting knife, bottled water, 2 pairs of prescription eyeglasses, an empty prescription medicine bottle, and several shirts. Since much of the clothing featured motorcycle emblems, this made investigators look into the possibility that the bone fragments might have been Tom. When Barbara looked at these items, she identified them as belonging to Tom, but a death certificate could not be issued without more conclusive evidence that the remains were him. Since dental records could not produce a positive identification, they would have to utilize DNA testing. The case was featured on an episode of Unsolved Mysteries in April of 1993, and at that point, the DNA testing had not yet been done since there was a delay in getting blood samples from his relatives who lived on the East Coast. But on January 11, 1994, exactly 2 years after the bone fragments were found, the results of the testing were announced, and the victim was conclusively identified as Tom Roche. His cause of death turned out to be a gunshot wound, but authorities have never provided any more specific details. While this seemed to establish that Tom had been a victim of foul play, the presence of his duffel bag and personal possessions at the scene created a number of unanswered questions. This seemed to imply that Tom had packed to leave on a trip, but why would he have done that if he was planning to meet Barbara for lunch only a few hours after dropping her off at work? Sadly, the investigation hit a complete standstill, and Barbara Rondeau would pass away in 2010 at the age of 49. After more than 26 years, there are still no answers about who may have been responsible for the death of Tom Roche. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. So like I mentioned in the intro, I consider this to be one of the more underrated cases featured on Unsolved Mysteries, because even though it's not as heavily discussed as some others, it's pretty baffling, and it's hard to come up with a concrete theory to explain everything that happened. You know how some cold cases just have that one clue which throws everything out of whack and leaves you scratching your head? In this case, I'd say that clue is the duffel bag and all of the personal items belonging to Tom, which were found near his bone fragments. Without that, it would be easy to believe that this is just a standard case of someone being abducted and murdered, but this evidence suggests that Tom had packed a bag to travel somewhere, which really doesn't make much sense at all. But we'll talk more about that in a little while. Unfortunately, there really isn't all that much information out there about this case. Of course, it was on Unsolved Mysteries, and an extensive article was also written about it in the Los Angeles Times in July of 1992 by none other than Michael Connolly, who worked as a crime reporter for the newspaper before he became a best-selling author, and I'm sure you remember hearing our ads for his new podcast in recent episodes. After the skeletal remains were officially identified as Tom, the case just seemed to hit a brick wall, and there has been no coverage or any new developments in the investigation since then. Out of all the bereaved people who were interviewed on Unsolved Mysteries, Barbara Rondeau was one of the people I felt most sorry for because she looked absolutely destroyed by Tom's disappearance. Tom and Barbara had essentially been together since she was a teenager, and Barbara mentioned numerous times that Tom was pretty much her whole life. Since she waited until the following morning to report Tom missing, I briefly considered the possibility that perhaps Barbara was involved in his disappearance, but it doesn't sound like she was ever considered a suspect, and I have zero doubt that she was genuinely distraught during her Unsolved Mysteries interview, so I think we can rule out that theory without hesitation. It was very sad to learn that she died in 2010 and was only 49 years old. I don't know any details about her cause of death, but tragically, it's not uncommon for the loved ones of crime victims to die at a very young age, as the stress and trauma of the whole ordeal can often have a major impact on their health. Now, even though Tom was a big, burly guy who loved riding his Harley-Davidson and belonged to a motorcycle club, it's important to establish that he wasn't part of some biker gang. The majority of people out there who are motorcycle enthusiasts are actually regular, law-abiding citizens, and just because they belong to a club does not necessarily mean they're members of the Hells Angels. The Unsolved Mystery segment made sure to emphasize that the people in Tom's club were doctors, plumbers, and accountants, just everyday folks who work normal jobs, and the same thing applies to Tom and Barbara. In spite of his biker-like appearance, Tom actually served in the Navy after graduating high school, and at the time he went missing, he was transitioning from one management job to another, so he definitely seemed like a stable, responsible, and likable guy, and he had no history of run-ins with the law. It seems like no one who knew Tom can think of any possible suspects who may have had a motive to murder him. However, during the aforementioned Los Angeles Times article about the case, one of the detectives stated, quote, "He liked to hang out on the edge of society. There was always the possibility that being a wannabe, he tied himself up with the wrong people." End quote. So I guess the implication is that even though Tom didn't ordinarily associate with dangerous bikers, he might have crossed paths with one who killed him. It's worth noting that during their first season of the show, Unsolved Mysteries presented two other motorcycle-related cases from California involving male victims. One of them involved a music DJ named Lee Selwyn, who was chased and run down by a pickup truck driver named Franklin Legrand Perkins. Like Tom Roche, Lee Selwyn and his friends were just regular law-abiding citizens who just happened to be motorcycle enthusiasts, and his death likely came about because Perkins saw a group of guys riding in motorcycles through downtown Los Angeles one night and wanted to start trouble with them. So I can see Tom possibly being harmed by someone who had a personal problem with bikers and decided to target Tom because of how he looked. The other motorcycle-related case on Unsolved Mysteries involved a young man named Gus Hoffman who went missing in Los Gatos in 1978. Even though Gus's body was never found, it turned out that he was targeted by a vicious motorcycle gang called the Forgotten Few because they saw Gus riding around on a Harley-Davidson which he had spent 8 months restoring. So the gang lured Gus to their hideout and brutally murdered him just so they could steal his motorcycle. I don't think stealing Tom's Harley-Davidson was the motive for his death, since it was left behind at his apartment complex when he disappeared, but if Tom ran afoul of an outlaw biker gang, the Gus Hoffman case demonstrates how willing they can be to murder innocent people for no reason. Now, I guess we do have to address the possibility that Tom took off and committed suicide, because even though I find it unlikely, it doesn't sound like the idea has been completely discounted. Even though it was established that Tom's cause of death was a gunshot wound, it's never been specifically stated that no gun was found at the scene where his remains were discovered. But of course, if there was a gun, I think law enforcement would have mentioned it. I know that when a person's body is left in a wooded area, animals and scavengers will often scatter the remains, which explains why only some of Tom's bone fragments were found. However, I have my doubts that animals would move an entire gun away from the scene, especially when you consider how many of Tom's other personal items were found there. Yes, there were definitely no signs that Tom was depressed and suicidal at the time he went missing, as he was only a few days away from starting a new job, and he deposited money in his bank account that morning. But suicidal people can sometimes do illogical things which don't make much sense, and just because someone seemed happy on the outside does not necessarily mean they are not depressed on the outside. All that being said, I think the evidence does suggest that someone fatally shot Tom and disposed of his body by pushing it down the hillside into those woods in Placer County. Of course, the big question is, since this location was 500 miles from his home, how did Tom wind up there to begin with? Well, we'll have to start off by retracing his steps on the day he went missing. We know that he dropped Barbara off at work that morning before heading to the bank to make 2 deposits. This is the biggest piece of evidence to suggest that Tom had no plans to run away, because if he was leaving town, why wouldn't he have withdrawn any money from the account? All indications seem to be that he would return to his apartment for the next few hours before meeting Barbara for lunch at noon. The last confirmed sighting of Tom took place about an hour later at 9:30, when Tom's neighbor claimed she saw him speaking with another man next to a brown pickup truck. Assuming the sighting is accurate, and the witness wasn't mistaken about the date or anything, then it seems this unidentified man is the best suspect to be Tom's killer. Unfortunately, it doesn't look like the neighbor got a good enough look at the man to create a composite sketch, so all we know is that he was a white male. Now, it was reported that Tom was looking inside the bed of the pickup truck, which seems to suggest this man had something to show Tom, so perhaps he was planning to sell him some parts for his motorcycle. Unless Tom was forcibly abducted, I have my doubts that they would have left together in the pickup at that moment, since the apartment's front door was left unlocked. When Barbara returned home later that afternoon, she found the newspaper unopened, and the battery Tom was planning to install on his motorcycle was still on the counter, so this suggests that the man arrived at the apartment a very short time after Tom returned home, or he was already there waiting for him, so Tom didn't get the chance to do anything else. But no one knows who this man could have been, since it doesn't sound like Tom mentioned anything to Barbara about meeting someone that morning. So if Tom was murdered by this guy, the only potential lead we have is the anonymous letter which was sent to Barbara later that week, and we can't even be certain if all the information contained in that letter is 100% true. Since the letter was accompanied by Tom's driver's license, credit card, and earring, that definitely proves there's legitimacy to it, meaning that it was either written by the killer or that Tom disappeared on his own and wrote the letter himself to throw everyone off the track. Of course, even if the writer really did murder Tom, that doesn't necessarily mean the situation played out like he described. There is at least one confirmed lie in the letter, as the writer claimed he disposed of Tom's body in a mountainous area around Los Angeles. But his remains were actually found 500 miles away in Placer County, but I suppose the alternate explanation is that the killer decided to retrieve them from their original burial spot and move them to another location after they wrote the letter. Regardless, the writer claimed that he originally met Tom at a strip joint and then lured him to a meetup to have him killed. It's true that Tom did like to frequent strip clubs, and Barbara apparently knew this and was okay with it, so there is some credibility to this claim. The mention of the strip joint has actually made a few online sleuths theorize that perhaps Tom's killer was a woman he had become involved with, and Barbara did not know about this. But of course, then you would probably have to discount the sighting of Tom with the white man at the apartment complex that morning. Anyway, the motive the killer seems to provide for his crime in the letter is that he was a Vietnam veteran who enjoyed the act of killing a bit too much and got the urge to kill again after many years. He makes a specific reference to notorious serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer, who was getting a lot of publicity at that time since Dahmer's arrest took place in Milwaukee in July of 1991, less than 2 months before Tom's disappearance. What I find unusual is that Dahmer's name is misspelled in the letter as Behemer, Behemer. I don't know if I'm reading too much into that or if it has any significance at all, but that just seems like a very unusual way to misspell Dahmer. The writer's implication is that learning about Dahmer's crimes gave him that final push to kill again, and I think the reference to Dahmer is interesting because Dahmer only murdered male victims, so the writer may have been trying to provide some context for the decision to target a male like Tom Roche. While Dahmer's crimes were sexually motivated, it's impossible to tell if this played any role in Tom's death, since there was nothing left but bone fragments when he was found. The letter writer seems to imply that he did not know Tom personally and selected him as a victim after meeting him at a strip joint before orchestrating a setup to have Tom killed. Of course, the weird part about this plan is that Tom was a burly, 6'2", 210-pound biker who looked like he was able to handle himself. Unless the killer was just looking for a personal challenge, Tom seems like a very unusual selection to be a murder victim. This is why some people believe that the scenario outlined in the letter was bogus, and that the killer was actually someone Tom knew and trusted. This person specifically targeted Tom for personal reasons, which is how they managed to lure him into a situation where he was murdered. So there's a good possibility that all the talk about Vietnam and Jeffrey Dahmer was nothing more than a fantasy to distract everyone from the real reasons the killer wanted Tom dead. But until this killer is identified, we'll probably never know whether this letter was sent because they had genuine feelings of guilt or if they just felt like taunting Tom's loved ones. Now, the biggest point which has been used to support the theory that Tom could have taken off voluntarily was the eyewitness sighting from Andy Marsala, who claimed he saw Tom in his parts shop on September the 14th, the day after he went missing. And since Tom didn't chat with Marsala like he normally did, and slipped out of the shop before they had a chance to speak, this would seem to imply that Tom did not want to be seen. Well, if this sighting was accurate, it does lend credence to the idea that Tom ran away, but authorities seem inclined to believe that Marsala got his dates mixed up. Indeed, if Tom was trying to disappear and fake his own death, it does seem strange that he would decide to frequent a shop where he knew the owner would recognize him. There have been numerous unsolved mystery segments where eyewitnesses have been absolutely certain that they saw a missing person at a time after they originally vanished, but then it later turned out the victim was already dead by this point, so the witness had to have been mistaken and either got their dates mixed up or confused the victim with someone else because memories are not infallible. In Andy Marsala's case, he knew Tom personally, so he probably did see him at the shop at some point around that time period, but it was just on another day prior to September the 14th. Of course, this also makes me ponder the possibility that the witness from the apartment complex who claimed to have seen Tom with a man next to the pickup truck on the morning of his disappearance might also be mistaken about the date, and this sighting doesn't have significance either, but it seems like authorities find it to be more credible. However, like I mentioned earlier, the one detail which really complicates this story and has always left me pulling out my hair in frustration is the discovery of Tom's duffel bag and a number of his personal items at the location his remains were found. While this doesn't prove that Tom was planning to run away and start a new life, it does suggest that he had packed a bag in order to take a trip somewhere before he was killed, a situation which doesn't fit the facts at all. As you well know, when Tom dropped Barbara off at work that morning, he told her he was planning to meet her back there for lunch at noon. He gave no indication to Barbara at all that he was planning to travel somewhere that day, and it seemed like he was just going to spend the morning at home installing a new battery on his motorcycle. But let's just say the man in the pickup truck showed up at Tom's apartment and convinced Tom to accompany him somewhere on a trip for whatever reason. If Tom decided he needed to leave town, why wouldn't he call Barbara at her workplace to let her know he wouldn't be showing up for lunch? Everything I've heard about Tom and the nature of his relationship with Barbara does not paint him as the type of guy who would just take off somewhere without telling his spouse. Unless Tom was living a double life and was very secretive about certain things, I have no idea what would compel him to do this. Remember, there were several shirts found at the crime scene and enough items to suggest that Tom had packed for a trip which was intended to last for a couple of days. But it does not seem like it was in Tom's character to disappear like that for an extended period of time without telling his girlfriend, and let's not forget that he was slated to start a new job at the end of the weekend. The other problem is that the apartment's front door was left unlocked, and I don't see why Tom would do that if he was going to be away for a while. But if Tom was forcibly abducted from his apartment, why would he pack a bag beforehand? The only scenario I can think of is that perhaps someone showed up there who convinced Tom that it was in his best interest to leave on a trip with him. After Tom packs a bag, he tells this person that he has to call Barbara at work to cancel their lunch date and let her know he's leaving, but Tom's companion doesn't want anyone else knowing he's there. When Tom is insistent about calling Barbara, this guy draws a gun and orders Tom to leave the apartment, and he also forces him to take his travel bag along in order to make it look like Tom left voluntarily. Of course, there are a number of things wrong with this scenario, as this was an apartment complex with numerous residents, so it would not be easy to stage an abduction without drawing anyone's attention, and Tom was a large man who would have been difficult to control. Also, one of the items found at the crime scene was a hunting knife, and I'm not sure the killer would have allowed Tom to take a potential weapon along if he was being abducted. One possible theory is that the perpetrator killed Tom sometime that day, left his body at another location, and then returned to Tom's apartment before Barbara got home, which he would have been able to access because the front door was unlocked. He then packed some of Tom's clothing and random personal items into a duffel bag in order to give off the false impression that Tom left on an impromptu trip. But if the killer's intention was to create a diversion, I'm not sure it worked, since it doesn't sound like Barbara even noticed that some of Tom's possessions were missing from the apartment. And of course, this tactic would have been completely negated 6 days later when the anonymous confession letter to Tom's murder was mailed to Barbara. Another clue I've always found a bit baffling is the discovery of an empty prescription medicine bottle among Tom's possessions. Investigators have never disclosed what type of medicine was supposed to be in this bottle, and it's possible the label was removed, so they don't even know. But it goes without saying that it makes no sense for Tom to pack an empty prescription bottle into his duffel bag, which seems to indicate that its contents were removed at some point. I did briefly ponder the possibility that this medicine could have been used by Tom to commit suicide, and that he traveled to a quiet, isolated spot at the bottom of a hillside in order to swallow some pills. Or perhaps the bottle was deliberately emptied by the person who killed Tom and wanted to give off the false impression that he'd overdosed. Regardless, the whole overdose theory is completely negated by the fact that Tom's cause of death was determined to be a gunshot wound, so I'm not sure if this prescription bottle holds any significance. It's just a very odd detail in a very odd case. Anyway, I know I say this about a lot of cases on the podcast, but I can't help but feel there's just one major piece of the puzzle missing in this story. Perhaps there was something going on in Tom's life during this time period which neither Barbara nor any of his other friends and family knew about. Whatever the case, I do believe Tom's killer, who may have very well been the man seen with him at the apartment complex, was someone who knew Tom beforehand. They may have just been casual acquaintances who originally met at a strip club, but didn't have a significant enough relationship that Tom ever bothered to mention this guy to Barbara. He may have told Tom that he dealt in motorcycle parts and was planning to hook him up with something that he wanted. I think Tom was not expecting this man to show up at the apartment on the morning of September the 13th, because otherwise he might have told Barbara about it. But he likely went there under the pretense of selling Tom something which was in the bed of his pickup truck. He then used this to lure Tom into a situation where he was murdered. Of course, I have no idea how the duffel bag or Tom's scattered possessions fit into this scenario, or why his body was found a full 500 miles from his home. I can understand the logic of disposing of evidence at a location which was a great distance away from where the victim went missing, but 500 miles is still an awfully long way. Overall, I am completely stumped on this one, and it sounds like the investigators were too. One thing I'm pretty certain about is that Tom was a victim of foul play, and that the confession letter was actually written by the killer, but as far as motive for the crime, and how much information in that letter was true, I have no idea. If this person really did target Tom Roche at random and murdered him just to experience the thrill of killing, then I'd say there's a good chance they've killed again, and for all we know, they may currently be in prison for another crime. I know that no fingerprints could be found on the confession letter, but I have to wonder if they would find anything if they decided to test the evidence today for DNA. So let's hope investigators haven't given up on this one and might find some way to solve it in the future. Anyway, if you happen to have any information on the unexplained death of Tom Roche, please contact the appropriate authorities. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Another reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. We've already produced a bunch of exclusive bonus episodes for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3, and this month, we've got a new episode about a very unusual case of alleged amnesia. It covers the disappearance of a man named Lawrence Joseph Bader, who vanished without a trace, but reappeared years later under a completely new identity, claiming to have no memory of his former life. It's a crazy story, so to learn more information, feel free to visit our Patreon page. I'd also like to take a moment to give a shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon this week, and they are Liam P., Vicky W., Amy O., and Andrea K. Thank you all so much for your support. And you may have heard that for the third consecutive year, I will be representing The Trail Went Cold by appearing on Podcast Row at CrimeCon, being held at the Hilton Riverside Hotel in New Orleans from June 7th to the 9th. If you would like to purchase tickets to the event, but haven't already done so, we have our own personalized promo code you can use in order to get 10% off a standard badge. So to receive your 10% discount, please visit crimecon.com and enter the promo code COLD19. That's COLD19. In addition, I will also be appearing at another event, the True Crime Podcast Festival, being held at the Marriott Downtown Hotel in Chicago on July 13th. So to learn more information about this event and to purchase tickets, feel free to visit their website at tcpf2019.com. That's tcpf2019.com. Also just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. Need to provide a big thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or a review on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music, or Spotify. So have yourself a good week, and join me next Wednesday for another brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.